It is a pleasure and honor to be here tonight and to continue our crash course or lecture, Travel Through Jewish History. Thank you all for coming. God bless you. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's also those people who are not physically here but watching us, whatever it is. God bless you. It's a pleasure and good feeling that people everywhere learn about our history. The subject we finished last week was the 2nd century, the time of the great Greek and their influence of the Jewish people. As you know, there are so many subjects involving Jewish thought and Jewish learning and Jewish teaching that involve with Greek culture, Greek methodology, and more. If I ask around for people to give me example, I'm sure with this intelligent crowd that there are many examples of Jewish people using Greek terms. Furthermore, even names of great rabbis are Greeks. Just to mention the name we mentioned last week in the Ethics of the Fathers, in the 1st chapter, we have a name of one of the great rabbis by the name of Antigonos, from a city called Socho. It's basically a Greek name which we believe either a fellow that converted to Judaism or a Jew that chooses to be part of the Greek name or the parents. But the key is it's a great influence. The easy example we used last week, the very end, I assume that you all remember, is the Pesach. You know, during the Passover Seder, we are taking the key fun for the kids, which is what? The Afikoman. The Afikoman obviously is come from what language? From a Greek language. And this Apikuman, bring the dessert. Earliest time in the temple, they used to have the priests preparing all the offering, and they leave aside a portion for the very end of the services. So that's called Apikuman from Greek. So obviously, it was a good news and a bad news. The good news is that the Greek per se did not intend to physically kill Jews. However, as far as the Jewish soul or Jewish spirituality, it was a contention point, or I even said a great tension between the rabbis, or the way that the sages, later the Pharisees, conceptualized what Judaism is all about and Jewish value versus the Greek idea. A good example is the sexual immorality, the idea of nudity, the worship of body by the Greek methodology and Greek culture. To this very day, if you go to places in Europe, not only Greek, you see those many hundreds or even thousand gods and goddesses. You see a lot of public worshipping for those idea of body, and it's very important to remember that the concept of gymnasia or the place of people get together to watch different sports, and I'm not here to criticize, I'm just speaking about the culture and the cultural influence upon the Jewish soul, especially at that broken time, which is the time of the era of the Second Temple, obviously have tremendous amount of result to this very day. You can study any subject in Judaism, from contemporary to rabbinic writing to Talmudic text, responsa and more, that they have something with Greek, from science to philosophy and more. It involves somehow, even the word philosophy from Philo is based on the idea of Greek. One of the great figures that applies to that time was the king by the name of Talmai. Talmai was one of those kings that obviously the way that in retrospect we look backward, was one of those kings that have more ill feeling to Judaism than the others. But he did something that may interpreted by scholars as a good deed. Most of the rabbis hold it was a bad deed. He wanted to translate the Torah to Greek. So in a simple understanding, we are now living in a culture that every good author have 50 or even 70 languages. You look at Harry Potter, how many languages, and many other great authors, they have translation. However, the rabbis felt when you're translating something that especially so sensitive and sacred like the Bible, like the Torah, you're creating your own agenda, especially when it's come to a sensitive philological, terminological of exception of words. The expression of certain way can be easily misconstrued by the people who are not educated, by lay people. So what he did, which is by itself very vicious, he commended 70 elders, 70 scholars, I'm just paraphrasing the Talmud, to go to 70 different rooms in his palace. And he gave them a certain short time, if I'm not mistaken, 2 or 3 days, and he asked them to translate the core of the Bible to Greek. Now, that by itself created great trepidations, because it was certain things in the Hebrew Bible that can be easily interpreted as offensive for other cultures, especially at that sensitive time of the Greek. The rabbis describe one of the greatest miracles that ever happened to Jewish people is when these 70 elders came out and he collected the manuscript of their translation of the Torah. It was all matched the same thing. Meaning was way before the era of computers, the era of other things, and they all came out the same thing. Obviously, the rabbis go at length to say that this is one of the greatest miracles that ever happened to the Jews. And if you read more rabbinic literature, is really fascinating. Example is like the Talmai, the king, his wife was name is Arnevet. And in the text of the Torah, by the list of non-kosher animal, one of them, it's called Arnefet in the Torah. And the way that the 70 different rabbis, elders translated was very different than the literal text. And in a way, they get away with something that can be very offensive to him personally. There are many other examples, like God descendants from heaven to punish the people, and many more examples the Talmud use how miracle took place at that time. But it shows you what they try to do. They try to basically move the Jewish soul, to assimilate the Jewish people with the Greek culture. I remember when I studied that in the yeshiva, that text, how the Talmai, the king, took 70 sages and put them in the 70 rooms. So our teacher said something that was so funny but fascinating too. He says, imagine if they have 70 rabbis, the same room, needs to do the same job of translation. No one agree with anybody. But when you separated them and they have a great fear and they're in different locations, they came out with the same translation. But anyway, the idea is that from that point onward, the whole concept of taking the Pentateuch or taking the text and translating it to a different language, it in a way paved the way to make it kosher, to make it okay to do. Now, the problem we have to this very day, which the sages at that time regretted tremendously, is the idea that whenever you take a text, especially sacred text, and loosen up by translating it to other languages, you lose something. And one of our core problems, not only with the Bible, but other writings, is you have triple translations. You have like Hebrew to Latin, or Hebrew to Greek, Greek to Latin, Latin to English. You know, or even more. This is one of the things I must confess. I sat the other day with someone. She used to work for the United Nations as a translator to Spanish. And the publisher at that time gave her one of my books. He wanted to translate it from English to Spanish. And I tried to say that even the English part of my writing, I put my heart and soul to make sure that it's said it properly and have the spirit of the writings. So I was on the Skype and on the phone for endless hours to make sure that the spirit, even of the English, which is a translation of the Hebrew text, can reflect the message of the book, because that's common. So what happened is the rabbi obviously oppose it, but they understand in their level that that's the will of the Lord, and therefore they go along with that. If you think about languages, just as a side comment, Hebrew language is one of those rough languages. Let's face it. I'm not trying to run away from reality. Hebrew language is one of those serious languages that have only about 26,000 words. If you try to compare it to English, they claim that it's more than 600,000. So by any means, the expression of Hebrew, the tenses and the expression, it's much rougher. So now you're taking the Hebrew, you translate it to Greek, and then from Greek you translate it to English nowadays, toward Latin sometimes. Obviously it creates its own endless set of problems. So when I see people pointed out, Rabbi, tell me, it said in English something that doesn't make sense, right? And David talked to God and he said G-A-D. And I tried to tell them that that was the name of one of the early prophets in the Bible, and it's not G-O-D. But because God is written in Hebrew and then translated to a few languages, people think that it meant to say that David talked to God. I'll just give you a small example. Another one is in the book of Isaiah. That's common difference between Catholicism and Judaism. In the book of Isaiah, I cannot tell you how many times I went to that argument. Even in my previous place in Annapolis, Maryland, I have a neighbor who is a righteous evangelical, and we befriended. But one of the point of disagreement with this orthodontist is he always pointed in Isaiah that they said about implication about Mary, because they used the word Alma. And I tried to tell him that in the pure Hebrew, Alma meaning a young woman. When you talk about virgin, in Hebrew is the word Betula, not Alma. But the problem is, if you start translating and twisting it with a certain agenda, they said that Isaiah already prognosticated the Virgin Mary, which has nothing to do with reality if you go strictly with the Hebrew text. It reminds me, again, side note, that if you click the Song of Songs, my reading Song of Songs several years ago, and you scroll down the comments that came out, some people in Middle Eastern world said that the word Mahmadim, which is expression of love between God and the people, it's implication to Muhammad. But try to tell them that Song of Songs is more than 3,000 years ago, and the time of Muhammad is 1,400 years ago. So what I try to tell you is there is a notion of people that take the agenda by the wrong interpretation or the wrong translation of the text, and that's a point of confusion between religion and religious aspect. In a way, there is another lesson to be learned in the interaction between the Greek and the Greek culture and the Jews. World history, and particularly the history of the Jewish people, prove when you're treating the Jews very nicely, right, it's a problem. Because when the time of the Greek, when the Jews treated well, then basically they are ready to be part and assimilate with the culture. The moment that you are strong of them, forceful with the Jews, tell them that they have to do it certain way against the will, all of a sudden you see the Pintalayid, you see the Jews start fighting against that idea. That's the history, lesson of history from the earliest time to our days. So many rabbis hold that that's the basis of the story of Chanukah. As you all know, it's from that time, the 2nd century, the famous story of the idea that the Jewish people should inculturate it and be part of the assimilation of the Greek culture. So they have those rules like eating pork, or the prohibition against Brit Milah, the prohibition against circumcision, because in the Greek methodology that's harming the human body, the beauty of worshiping the body and the human body. So they brought their god or goddess, Zeus, another goddess, to the temple. And obviously the Jews, the moment you're forcing them, as we said earlier, then they start fighting against it, and that's the foundation of the famous story of Chanukah, which we're not going there yet. One of the great early British ruler was the Duke of Wellington. I'm sure that the great historian like Bruce will tell you the Duke of Wellington is a hereditary title of the senior rank in the United Kingdom, the earliest time. It derived from the Wellington to Somerset, and it was created for the early time, the first Arthur Wellesley, which is the 1769 to 1852. One of the fascinating statements that he said, and I just quote him, he said, "The only greater problem of defeat is victory." What he meant by that, he meant to say that defeat sometimes can be a problem because when you win something that is unexpected, right, then you have an issue of how to handle it in both ways. If you lose unexpectedly or you win unexpectedly, all of a sudden you have an issue to handle a new situation. That's basically the story of the Chashmonaim, the Chashmonaim of that time. They basically won against the Greek at that time. And then all of a sudden they wanted to create independent state, autonomy and independent state. It creates a lot of problems. I just give you again the vignette, the outline. It was a great high priest by the name of Simon, Shimon. And the Mishnah described him not only as a great pious man, but the tradition was that the Chashmonaim was descendants from the house of David, which is the house of the not only the kingdom, but also the high honor of a high priest. So Shimon, Simon, he basically cooperated with the new rulers, which was the Roman who took over, and he basically let them come to the land that was the land of Israel, you can say. But the problem is, you get rid of the Greek, now you have the Romans. So it's always a question, is that good for the Jews or bad to the Jews? Many said that it was worse. Shimon the righteous have a full support of the Sanhedrin, which was the 71 Supreme Rabbinic Court, which we will discuss later. In one hand he was the high priest, on the other hand he was the ruler. The rabbis have a problem with that, because when you consecrate, you give power to one person, and so much power, which is high priest and the ruler, it can create corruption. So usually the rabbis oppose that. With him it was, they call him Simon the Righteous, because he was one of the rare characters that did not abuse the office. But anyway, the Chashmonaim in general made a lot of mistakes. One of the well-known mistakes is that they basically forcefully converted people from the south. It's called the Adumimes. That group was not a sincere people who wants to be part of the Jewish faith. We always said when someone wants to be Jewish, you have to check if it's the alternative, other motivation that is not real wanting to be part of Jewish faith. The common denomination among the rabbis, they said, look, if you talk about afterlife, if you talk about relationship between God and people, you do not need to be Jewish to go to the world of truth after life and gain peace. Basically the requirement for the non-Jews is called the 7 universal Noahide laws, which again is not part of our discussion. You do not need to force people. It's against the core of Jewish faith. We never proselytize, we never force people to be part of our faith. Obviously it creates a tremendous resentment and sadness, and many scholars hold that that was the core of the final destruction of the temple, because of those people, the same way in a way that people left Egypt and Moses complained that they are not sincere Egyptian in a sense of part of new Jewish faith, and they just came to take part of our out of slavery, being out of Egypt, the same way as those people that became part of our faith and was very destructive. The king of Chashmonaim was very strong, was very popular, and eventually, yes, it was an internal war between the rabbis and the kingdom of the Chashmonaim. The war was basically a power war. For example, who has the right to rule the temple? If you read a literature of early Christianity and understanding what happened in the second temple and how things happen, it's very similar to what we discuss here, which is the rabbis, you call them names, Pharisees, or whatever it is, the rabbis at that time basically felt that the Jewish law and the spirit of Jewish law should have autonomy over services and over certain things that took place in the temple. The king of Chashmonaim tried to say that I'm in charge, I'm the administrator. I always joke, said, when it's come to synagogue business, it's always fine line between the chairman of the board or president and the rabbi. Who's doing what and who has more power? It's a very sensitive subject, and obviously I'm not going to elaborate this form. But at that time, what happened is, it was one of the famous crises the Mishnah described. It was an altar, and people used to take the altar and put water as part of the ritual on the altar. And the king of Chashmonaim tried to show their power, and they basically took the water, instead of putting it on the altar, they put it on the floor of the temple. And as a result, it was no exaggeration, thousands of people took the esrog that we use as part of the 4 species in Sukkot and basically stoned them, those people. And that created internal war that ended eventually with the destruction. If you try to analyze the Chashmonaim in a very short time, because we're running here in a long subject for short time, obviously some of them are good, some of them righteous, some of them are very wicked. One of the well-known is the Alexander Yanai, the very famous one, that he was great in a sense of expanding the land of Israel to Syria, to Lebanon. He served as a high priest. In addition, he came from the descendancy of the high priest. As we said earlier, the rabbis oppose all this idea of one person have so much power to control both high priest and the administration and the kingdom. And that's, again, you see how the history repeats itself. But anyway, when Yanai the king passed away, that was the end of the era of the Chashmonaim. And as we explained, the Romans took over. The bad news at that time is that the Jews turned to be a puppet. Meaning, for a long time, the Romans basically used the Jews as some type of puppet in the land of Israel. The Roman was very strong, was very powerful nation. If you look at the history of particularly the year 63, before the Common Era, Jerusalem was conquered by the Romans. The whole entire Jewish autonomy was under the Romans' ruler, and from this on to about 345 years, it was total sovereignty, total control of the Romans. A famous example is the psychopath Herod. You heard that name? Herod was the guy that, in one hand, he was a great construction builder, ingenious person that rectified and built one of the nicest, some said the nicest building that ever built in the land of Israel. On the other hand, he was a mass murderer. At the beginning of his life, in very short, should be a separate lecture, he married the daughter of one of the Chashmonaim king, which gave him legitimacy, but he was extremely psycho, paranoid. He killed his own children, his wife committed suicide, and the entire nation of the Chashmonaim disappeared because of that. But if you go to the Western Wall, and you go to those tunnels, and you hear those lectures, and you hear the story, you look especially for the Western Wall, and you see it's built in different times, and you wondered, these huge stones that have so many tons, how they will be able. So some have some archaeological evidence that said it was human, meaning tens of thousands of people die while they try to lift up those stones on the top of donkeys or whatever it is and put one on the top of the others. That's, we're talking thousands of years before the common machinery, etc. So, as we said, the good news is he was a mass builder. The bad news is he was a total crazy person that did a horrible thing. But that time is the time of Hillel and Shamai. And I assume that if I ask you who is Hillel and who is Shammai, you know that there's many Hillel's houses in the country. There are many, many people that named after Hillel, after Shammai to this very day. And I heard a beautiful statement from the great Rabbi Berel Wein. Rabbi Berel Wein is not only a historian, and I highly recommend watching him, not only lectures but books and much more. One of his statements over that, he said that if you try to compare Herod to Hillel, and you ask people in our days, let's say we are in 2017, how many people name Herod and how many people name Hillel? That's basically a sign 2,000 years later who is really the person that makes a difference. Another big change that took place at that time is the expansion of the Jewish people, who's wandering Jews or meandering Jews around the world, particularly the huge transforming of a population from Israel to Rome, to later on Germany and Great Britain. That was the beginning of the era of the Jewish merchant, later on the era of a big Jewish merchant, the development of which we call later on the letter of credits and the checks and everything else that took place later. It was based on that idea that the Jews start scattering around the world. But back to Hillel and Shamai, Hillel and Shamai built for us a way of thinking. And if you remember last Shabbat, we studied the Mishnah from Hillel and Shamai. One of the things that we learn is the idea of the oral teaching. Up to the time of Rabbi, the whole oral teaching, whole tradition was handed by mouth from one generation to the next. Hillel and Shamai were good friends. Their students married to each other, yet Hillel in most of the cases were more lenient, where Shammai was kind of more strict. I'm just extemporaneously giving you an example to comprehend, just to get the key point. The Mishnah said in Tractate Brachot, if someone ate a meal, so he or she needs to make a grace after meal. We call it Birkat Hamazon. I'm sure that this intelligent crowd, you know what I'm talking about, right? So the next question the rabbis ask, so what happened if all of a sudden you left and now you are on the other side of Long Island and you realize, I didn't make the Birkat Hamazon. What should you do? Should we ask you to return the place you ate and make the blessings, or you should bless and say the bracha, the grace after meal, whatever you are? Just a typical example. It's not a personal fight. It's different views of seeing Jewish law. So for that case, just as an example, Shammai said, you have to return the place you ate. We follow Hillel. Hillel said, no, make the bracha whatever you are. Now, what both of them agree? Both of them agreed that about 72 minutes is the average person time of digestion, and therefore, if it's in that framework, one should make a grace after meal. The difference is, Shammai said, I want you to return. You know why? I give you the psychological mindset. Shammai said, look, if it was a $500 that you forgot in your purse, are you going back and pick it up? Or you said, who cares? You go back and pick it up because it's important for you. If God granted you, you know that out there are 50 million people today, just in Africa, that dream about a cup of coffee only once in their lives, right? How many people in Jerusalem to this very day, I read recently a horrible article that 54% of Jewish children in Jerusalem go to sleep hungry. And you open the refrigerator, there's nothing there, especially those with kind of large families. So if God granted you with the meal, it takes another 2 or 3 minutes of your time to thank Him, to say grace after meal. Thank you, God, for the meal. So therefore, if you are 10 minutes away, go back and make the blessing. That's Shammai notion. Hillel comes in and he said, hey, you cannot, I agree with you in a sense of strictness and the right things, but I'm practical. I don't want to make people feel too strict and too much. So as long as people make the blessings, we prefer that they should do it in the place that they ate. But if not, as long as they make the blessings, fine. So again, Hillel and Shammai are not enemies, right? They have a different opinion in Jewish laws, and the students marry each other, yet Shammai usually are much more stricter. You see, that's the structure of Hillel and Shammai. But anyway, the idea of the Mishnah, the writing of those disputations between many hundreds between Hillel and Shammai, and later on the Talmud, the Gemara, which is the exposition of the Mishnah. In general, the Mishnah, as we said many times, is the beginning of the common era, and it's go further for the first and the second century. But if you want to structure more kind of the way that the scholar hold, it's between 30 before Common Era until 200 before the Common Era. That's most of the scholar hold. That's the time that it was development, the structure of Jewish law. In general, when you talk Jewish law, and that's a subject we're going to talk in the future, how the Jewish law come to be and how the 450 years ago they have the Shulchan Aruch, it's based on those discussions that start at that time, which is the oral teaching of the Mishnah and the Talmud. But anyway, the Romans did a lot of things that aggravated the rabbis. The notion of teaching people paganism, a lot of mindset and philosophy that oppose the Jewish spirit, and therefore at the year 66 in the Common Era, the Jews start really fighting the Romans. And as you know, there are different groups when it's come to Jews, so it was basically 3 different groups that rebel against the Romans. The rabbis, which unfortunately most of the time people do not listen, they said to them, don't fight them, they are too mighty, they are too strong, you're going to lose. But people do not listen to them. Is that sounds familiar? Yeah. I know many rabbis like myself that before they start any job, they said, at the board meeting, I'm willing to come and give a report and goodbye. Right? Because the reality is the rabbis realize that, you know, you want to make the most effect on people, and when people just hear it from one ear and come out from the other ear, then don't waste your time, you can do other things. So anyway, the rabbis opposed it, and they warned the people, and they said, this will cause the destruction of the temple. But unfortunately, they did not listen, so it was divided to 3 different groups. One was the famous Zealous. It was a group that called Kanaim, Zealous group, that they basically said, we prefer to die rather than to be under the leadership of the Romans. It was a second group that, in the lucid language, you call them the mafia. And those people are basically charlatans or people who seek for a real personal gain for their future. That was the second group. And the third was the Jewish army that formulated to fight against the Romans. Obviously, the Romans sent the army, and tremendous of blood spilled over that, tremendous death. And in the year 68, it was totally clarified that we lost that war. The Zealous committed suicide. Later on, if you go to Masada, it's a famous story. As we said, the rabbis opposed it. In the year 70, we all know the story that the year 70 at the Tisha B'Av, the eve of and the 9th and the 10th day of Av, which reoccurred, the first temple destroyed on Tisha B'Av after 410 years, 70 years in between, and then it was another 420 years of second temple, the same day, Tisha B'Av, the eve of 9th of Av, the destruction of the temple. If you think about it, it was such a huge, gorgeous building that Herod builds, and the rabbis describe in the Talmud saying that that was the nicest building that ever built in the world. To think that just overnight was burned to the ground and ashes came from the